Alright, now that I've gone through all my models, the next thing I wanted to do was to go through my 1,000 greatest drivers list and the um, master driver list that I have here. This consists of every driver I think might possibly score at least 1 point um, for my 1,000 greatest drivers list based on the scoring rubric that I discussed a few days ago. I've decided that any driver who scores at least 25 career points according to the scoring rubric in that 1,000 greatest drivers post I discussed is a lock for my list, and there are 713 of those. I might eventually drop a couple of them down to lower cate to the next lower category, but this is pretty close to all the drivers I consider to be locks. I have not gone through and scored all their seasons yet. I have gone through and scored the seasons of all the drivers who are in bold, but I have not um, gone through the drivers who are not in boldface yet to go through all their seasons to determine their complete career score. I did go through every single driver I have in my bubble tier. I've decided you need 14 points to be on the bubble, and there are 253 drivers in that tier now. So I have 966 drivers in my top two tiers. So I've got a little room to play with. There are going to be some drivers I have presently in the near miss category, 10 to 13 points, who will eventually make the list. And I decided to and there are some drivers I have at 14 points that I really have doubts about, like Scott Goodyear and Dave Marcus, for instance, Rob Collard. Those are all kind of dodgy to me, and I may drop them. And obviously, I have room to include some drivers in this tier, and I also included on this list drivers who maybe haven't scored 10 career points yet, but drivers who I think are going to work their way into contention for the list by the time I'm done. Like if I was making the list based on what people have done through now, for instance, drivers like Kimi Antonelli, Oliver Behrman, Isaac Hadjar, Chase Briscoe, Chris Buescher, David Malukas, Christian Lundgaard, Morris Schering, etc. wouldn't be on it yet. But they probably, a lot of them probably will make it by the time I'm done, whether I finish in 2028 or 2029. I have a feeling, Connor Zilic, I have a feeling a lot of those drivers are going to blow up in the next couple years and become big stars, and by that point they might become worthy, even if I don't think they are worthy yet. So anyway, I wanted to read through all the drivers I have in my lock list. I do not know how to pronounce all of their names, so I'm probably going to butcher a few of them, but I doubt most of you have as much knowledge about racing history as I do, but hopefully I would like to attract a more auto racing centric audience, and I was wondering if anybody could recommend to me drivers that I do not have on my lock list who I should more strongly consider. You probably won't come up with anyone. I mean, maybe you might come up with some MotoGP racers, but I've decided not to include motorcycle racers on my list unless they achieve significant successes in cars. Obviously, there are drivers who came out of motorcycle racing like Tazio Nuvolari, Jimmy Johnson, Joe Weatherly, John Surtees, etc. They started as motorcycle races, but also achieved greatness and achieved their biggest degree of greatness in cars. So that is why there are locks on the list, while I won't have like Valentino Rossi on it, even though he's done a few things in cars. So anyway, I was wondering if anybody could recommend anybody that I do not have on this list who is worth considering. And I'm sure I'm going to butcher some of these names, especially the older European drivers where I have read about them a lot, but I'm not sure I have heard all their names pronounced. Rano Altonen, Laurent Aiello, Johnny Aitken, Nasser Al Attiyah, Michele Alboreto, Felipe Albuquerque, Marco Allen, Olympio Alencard Jr., Jean Alesi, Bobby Allison, Davey Allison, Donnie Allison, Fernando Alonso, Uwe Alzen, Joe Amato, Marcos Ambros, Michael Ammermuller, Chris Amon, Greg Anderson, Mario Andretti, Michael Andretti, Paolo Andrucci, Jean-Claude Andret, Max Angelelli, Billy Arnold, Alberto Ascari, Antonio Ascari, Roland Ash, Bill Alberlin, Didier Auriol, Mikel Azcona, Brady Bacon, Craig Baird, Buck Baker, Buddy Baker, Mauro Baldi, Jack Baldwin, Renato Balestrero, Earl Bomber, Joao Barbosa, Wolf Barnato, Rubens Barrichello, Johnny Beauchamp, Jean Barra, Christopher Bell, Derek Bell, Stefan Beloff, Jean-Pierre Beltoise, Robert Benoist. I know he's French. I really butchered that one, I bet. Olivier Beretta, Gerhard Berger, Jörg Bergmeister, Timo Bernhard, Kenny Bernstein, Andrea Bertolini, Ernesto Bessoni II, Gary Bettenhausen, Tony Bettenhausen, Mickey Biasian, Frank Biella, Greg Biffle, Tom Bigelow, Clemente Biondetti, Sam Bird, Ted Bjork, Ryan Blaney, Jerome Bleak-Mullen, Stig Blomqvist, Jeff Bodine, Georges Boileau, Colin Bond, Neil Bonnet, Joe Bonnier, Terry Borchler, Pietro Bordino, Mirko Bortolotti, Valtteri Bottas, Christophe Bouchou, Sebastian Bourdais, Terry Boutsen, John Bowe, David Brabham, Jeff Brabham, Jack Brabham, Kenny Breck, Don Branson, Craig Breedlove, Jason Bright, Gaston Brilly Perry, Ryan Briscoe, Peter Brock, Tony Brooks, Antron Brown, David Bruce Brown, Martin Brundle, Jean-Maria Bruni, Jimmy Bryan, Sebastian Buemi, Kaka Bueno, Richard Burns, Jeff Burton, Kurt Busch, Kyle Busch, Jensen Button, Red Byron, William Byron, Alessandro Cagno, James Colato, Tiago Camilo, Dan Camish, Giuseppe Campari, Malcolm Campbell, Matt Campbell, Augustine Canapino, Ronaldo Capello, Ron Capps, Rudolph Caracciola, Bob Carey, Pancho Carter, Gabriel Casagrande, Nick Cassidy, Elio Castroneves, Johnny Ciccato, Eddie Cheever, Gaston Chevrolet, Louis Chevrolet, Tom Chilton, Luigi Chinetti, Louis Chiron, Marcos Ciani, Jim Clark, John Cleland, Emmanuel Collard, Peter Collins, Eric Comas, Stefano Comini, Mike Conway, Josh Cook, Earl Cooper, Tom Colonel, Jeg Coughlin Jr., David Coulthard, James Courtney, Tyler Courtney, Elaine Cudini, Bill Cummings, Antonio Felix da Costa, Cristiano D'Amata, Robert Dahlgren, Yannick Dalmas, Ryan Dial, really bothers me that that's pronounced Dial, Dave Darland, Bernard Darniche, Jimmy Davies, Will Davison, Elio DeAngelis, Gilda Farron, João Paulo de Oliveira, Jake Dennis, Patrick DePailier, Ralph De Palma, Pete DePaulo, Ernie Dare, Lucas de Grassi, Luis Ruben De Palma, Paul DeResta, Albert Devo, Larry Dixon, Scott Dixon, Mark Donahue, Mark Douay, Romain Dumas, Dominique Dupuis, Loic Duval, Dale Earnhardt Jr., Carl Edwards, Sean Edwards, Jan Erlache, Frederick Ekblom, Matthias Ekstrom, Vic Elford, Bill Elliott, Chase Elliott, Dante Emiliosi, Erica Enders, Philip Eng, Mauro Engel, Christian Engelhart, Kenneth Erickson, Kevin Estra, Philippe Atanselin, Elfin Evans, Mitch Evans, Richie Evans, Teo Fabi, Luigi Fagioli, Juan Manuel Fangio, Augusto Farfus, Nino Farina, Red Farmer, Marcel Fassler, Brock Feeney, Ron Fellows, Ralph Furman, Giancarlo Fisichella, John Fitch, Christian Fittipaldi, Emerson Fittipaldi, John Fitzpatrick, Fonty Flock, Tim Flock, George Fulmer, Elliot Forbes Robinson, John Force, A.J. Foyt, Felipe Fraga, Dario Franchitti, Heinz Harold Frenzen, Robin Frines, George Fury, Juan Galvez, Oscar Galvez, Harry Gant, Antonio Garcia, Frank Gardner, Don Garlitz, Pierre Gasly, Oliver Gavin, Olivier Jean de Bien, Ian, I do not know how to pronounce that, Joggin, Fabrizio Giovanardi, Dieter Glemser, Bob Glidden, Timo Glock, Paul Goldsmith, Marcos Gomez, Paulo Gomez, Jose Froilan Gonzalez, Richard Goranson, Jeff Gordon, Robbie Gordon, Jules Gu, Hector Luis Gradassi, Stuart Graham, Harry Grant, Jamie Green, Peter Gregg, Alan Grice, Bobby Grimm, Marcus Gronholm, William Grover Williams, Esteban Guerrieri, Kenelm Lee Guinness, Dan Gurney, Armin Hain, Mika Hakkinen, Jim Hall, Pete Halsmer, Lewis Hamilton, Denny Hamlin, Sam Hanks, Kenneth Hansen, Ray Haroon, Brendan Hartley, Harry Hartz, Tim Harvey, Kevin Harvick, Masahiro Hasemi, Mike Hawthorne, Hurley Haywood, Alfred Hager, Nick Heidfeld, Victor Emery, Ray Hendrick, Wolf Hensler, Johnny Herbert, Hans Herman, Colton Herta, Jack Hewitt, Hans Heyer, Twan Hismans, Robert Height, Damon Hill, Graham Hill, Jake Hill, Phil Hill, Tracy Hines, Tommy Hinnerschitz, Miko Herbanen, David Hobbs, Chris Hodgetts, Irv Hare, Ingo Hoffman, Al Holbert, Bob Holbert, Bill Holland, Ted Horn, Sam Hornish Jr., Kazuyoshi Hoshino, Rob Huff, Patrick Heisman, Nico Hulkenberg, Denny Holm, James Hunt, Ryan Hunter Ray, Jim Hurtubise, Dick Hutcherson, Jackie Ix, Russell Ingle, Jack Ingram, Tom Ingram, Innes Ireland, Ernie Irvin, Bobby Isaac, Matt Jackson, Matthew Jaminet, Bob Jane, Jean-Pierre Jarier, Dale Jarrett, Ned Jarrett, Stephen Johansson, Gordon Johncock, Dick Johnson, Jimmy Johnson, Junior Johnson, Warren Johnson, Alan Jones, Brad Jones, Parnelli Jones, Andrew Jordan, Casey Kane, Doug Coletta, Tony Kanaan, Juha Kankunen, Helmut Kelleners, Rick Kelly, Tommy Kendall, Matt Kenseth, Mel Kenyon, Brad Keselowski, Leo Kinnunen, Mark Kinzer, Steve Kinzer, Kamui Kobayashi, Tom Christensen, Johan Christofferson, Robert Kubica, Alan Kulwicki, Bobby Labonte, Terry Labonte, Jacques Lafitte, Andy Lally, Jan Lammers, Pedro Lamy, Herman Lang, Nicolas Lapierre, Nicola Larini, Oscar Larari, Gerard Larousse, Kyle Larson, Pierre Lartigue, Yari Mati Latvala, Niki Lauda, Christian Lautenschlager, Charles Leclerc, J.J. Lato, Butch Leitzinger, Joe Leonard, David Leslie, Robin Liddell, Mark Lieb, Richard Leitz, Herbert Linge, Richard Lloyd, Frank Lockhart, Sebastian Loeb, Joey Logano, Patrick Long, Tony Longhurst, Richard Longman, Jose Maria Lopez, Fred Lorenzen, Andre Lauderer, John Love, Craig Lowndes, Klaus Ludwig, Lucas Lurr, Ari Leyendyke, Sasha Masson, Umberto Maglioli, Jan Magnussen, Timo Mäkinen, Tommy Mäkinen, Frederick Makovecki, Jean-Pierre Malcher, Nigel Mansell, Attilio Marinoni, Sterling Marlin, Jean-Michel Martin, Mark Martin, Maxime Martin, Omar Martinez, Jochen Mass, Felipe Massa, Ricardo Mauricio, Fabio Sotomayor, Rex Mays, Roger McCluskey, Bill McGovern, Jack McGrath, Bruce McLaren, Scott McLaughlin, Alan McNish, Colin McRae, Rick Mears, Jaime Mello, Alain Menu, Rene Mecgay. That's can't be how you pronounce it because he's French. I bet there's a silent letter in there. Louis Meyer, Norbert Michelish, Hanu Mikola, Ken Miles, Tommy Milton, Ferdinando Manoia, Gerhard Mitter, Stefano Modena, Alan Moffat, Guy Morat, Juan Pablo Montoya, Greg Moore, Paul Morris, Eduardo Mortara, John Morton, Mike Mosley, Sterling Moss, Mostert, Satoshi Motoyama, Roberto Moras, Brian Muir, Shirley Muldowney, Ralph Mulford, Dirk Mueller, Jorg Mueller, Nico Mueller, Sven Mueller, Yvonne Mueller, Sander Munari, Frank Mundy, Greg Murphy, Jimmy Murphy, Kazuki Nakajima, Satoru Nakajima, Alessandro Nannini, Emmanuel Naspetti, Felipe Nazar, Felice Nazaro, Matt Neal, Jandy Negrau, Norm Nelson, Terry Newville, Joseph Newgarden, Ryan Newman, Klaus Niedzwitz, John Nielsen, Lando Norris, Tazio Nuvolari, Johnny O'Connell, Pato O'Ward, Sebastian Ogier, Danny Ongeis, Guillermo Ortelli, Stefan Ortelli, Gary Paffett, Simon Pagenaud, Alex Pillow, Marvin Panch, Olivier Pane, Mike Parks, Reg Parnell, Benny Parsons, Jim Pascal, Ricardo Patrese, David Pearson, Cruz Pedregon, Tony Pedregon, Win Percy, Sergio Perez, Lionel Pernia, Henri Pescarolo, Stefan Peter Hansel, Ronnie Peterson, Lee Petty, Richard Petty, Oscar Piastri. I think he doesn't have 25 points yet now that I decided to not make him a top 5 driver this season. I was going to, but then he had his collapse. So maybe he should be in the second tier. There are a couple other guys I have in here, like Robin Liddell and Morgan Shepherd and Felix Rosenquist. Maybe I should still have in the second tier. But they had enough points to be up here, much to my surprise. Alessandro Pierguidi, Roy Pierpoint, Raffaele Pinto, Nelson Piquet, Emmanuel Pirro, Jason Plato, Al Pombo, Will Power, Thomas Preining, Andy Prio, Alain Prost, Don Prudhomme, Scott Pruitt, Eddie Pullen, Dieter Quester, Ronnie Quintarelli, Paul Radisich, John Ragnati, Bobby Rahal, Graham Rahal, Kimi Räikkönen, Rene Rast, Jim Rathman, Roberto Ravaglia, Brian Redman, Jim Reed, Clay Regazzoni, Anthony Reid, Dario Resta, Carlos Ruderman, Manuel Reuter, Peter Revson, Daniel Ricciardo, Jim Richards, Stephen Richards, Tim Richmond, Jochen Rindt, Fireball Roberts, George Robertson, Mike Rockenfeller, Pedro Rodriguez, Walter Rarrell, KK Rosberg, Nico Rosberg, Maury Rose, Bernd Rosemeyer, Felix Rosenquist, Louis Rosier, Alexander Rossi, Matthias Rossi, Andre Rossignol, Andy Rouse, Kalle Rovanpera, Oliver Rowland, Lloyd Ruby, Ricky Rudd, George Russell, Johnny Rutherford, Troy Ruttman, Rickard Rydell, Carlos Sainz Jr., Mika Salo, Timo Salonen, Roy Salvatori, Stefan Sarazin, Ludovico Scarfiati, Gary Selzy, Donny Schatz, Jody Scheckter, Timo Scheider, Jean-Louis Slesher, Bernd Schneider, Frankie Schneider, Walter Schock, Ken Schrader, Michael Schumacher, Ralph Schumacher, Tony Schumacher, Jack Sears, Logan Seavey, Henry Seagrave, Alain Simolan, Ayrton Senna, Chico Serra, Daniel Serra, Glenn Seaton, Scott Sharp, Wilbur Shaw, Gordon Shedden, Lee Shepard, Morgan Shepard. That's really dodgy. But he was good enough for long enough. I have him barely a lock. Joe Siffert, Juan Manuel Silva, Mark Scaife, Tom Sneva, Danny Snowbeck, Jimmy Snyder, Petter Solberg, Raymond Summer, Steve Soper, Bruno Spengler, Gordon Spice, Jackie Stewart, Tony Stewart, Frank Stippler, Rolf Stomelin, Ramos Stott, Hans Stuck, Hans Joachim Stuck, Danny Sullivan, John Surtees, Ashley Sutton, Toshio Suzuki, Cody Swanson, Bob Swikert, Sammy Swindell, Ferenc Shish, Yuji Tachikawa, Patrick Tambay, Ott Tanak, Garth Tander, Nick Tandy, Gabrielle Tarquini, Terry Tassin, Jordan Taylor, Ricky Taylor, Marshall Teague, Larry Tenvord, Teddy Tetzlaff, Leon Terry, Kurt Team, Nikki Team, Herb Thomas, Renee Thomas, Dick Thompson, James Thompson, Speedy Thompson, Johnny Thompson, Marcel Tiemann, Martin Tomchik, Steve Torrance, Paul Tracy, Juan Maria Traverso, Benoit Treluer, Dick Trickle, Maurice Trintignant, Martin Truex Jr., Yarno Trulli, Shosu Boy, Colin Turkington, Curtis Turner, Darren Turner, Bernard Unett, Al Unser, Bobby Unser, Al Unser Jr., Eric Van de Pel, Kelvin van der Linde, Shane Van Gisbergen, Dries Van Tour, Laurent Van Tour, Achille Varzi, Ari Vatanen, Jean-Eric Verne, Jean-Carl Vernet, Max Verstappen, Sebastian Vettel, Tony Vilander, Gilles Villeneuve, Jacques Villeneuve, Luigi Villaresi, Rich Vogler, Wolfgang von Trips, Bill Vukovic, Louis Wagner, Juichi Wakisaka, Bjorn Waldegard, Tom Walkinshaw, Andy Wallace, Rusty Wallace, Daryl Waltrip, Roger Ward, Derek Warwick, Cameron Waters, John Watson, Joe Weatherly, James Weaver, Mark Webber, Pascal Wehrlein, Bob Wellborn, Carl Wendlinger, Bob Wente, Marco Werner, Mariano Werner, Richard Westbrook, Dan Weldon, Jamie Wincup, Don White, Rex White, John Whitmore, Howdy Wilcox, Justin Wilson, Jean-Pierre Ramil, Joachim Winkelhock, Manfred Winkelhock, Marcus Winkelhock, Mark Winterbottom, Marco Whitman, Doug Wolfgang, Bob Wallach, Del Worsham, John Ensevel, Naoki Yamamoto, Kale Yarborough, Peter Zakowski, Alex Zanardi, Ricardo Zonta. I know I butchered a few of the names there. I think I said Prost instead of Prost. I mean, I have analyzed a lot more than I have watched. I mean, even like 80s and 90s F1 I haven't watched a lot of because it is so hard to watch because the races aren't on YouTube. So if you didn't catch them at the time, it is difficult for an American to watch unless you buy some really expensive streaming platform. So I've analyzed more than I've watched, and I butchered a lot of drivers' names of drivers who aren't obscure but obviously belong on the list. I think I said Pascal Wehrlein. Obviously, it's Wehrlein because he's German, and that's how you pronounce W in German. But I think I pronounced most of them right. And I do have a lock for every letter of the alphabet. That's one thing I wanted to do. I wanted to have a driver for every letter of the alphabet, which was stupid. But actually, X was the only one I had trouble with, and John Enseval does deserve it. He set the record for the most wins in a Belgian touring car season with 13 once in the 70s. In one of those years, he also won his first of back-to-back 24 hours of Spa, so he does deserve it. Anyway, um, probably if you know anything about auto racing, most of the drivers you have heard of are on that list, unless they became pop cultural celebrities for reasons other than their talent, like Danica Patrick or whoever, who I'm obviously not listing. But I was wondering if you do know a lot about racing, if there is anybody that I forgot there who you think might be deserving. Probably if you do, they're on this second list anyway, which I am not going to read. But spoilers. I guess I will provide spoilers at least that much for the drivers that I am considering, and the drivers in these last three tiers who I am probably not considering. The drivers in bold I've gone through and scored. The drivers who are not in bold I have not scored yet. But anyway, that's it. That's what I'm working on, and you can see all the drivers that I am considering strongly for the list. I really have to learn how to pronounce them all to be more professional, but thank you and good night.